Book 5, Chapters 1 to 14 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 5. Caesar's second invasion of Britain, the disaster at Aduatuca, Quintus Cicero at bay, the doom of Indutiomarus. Chapter 1. When Caesar, according to his yearly custom, was leaving his winter quarters for Italy, in the consulship of Lucius Domitius and Appius Claudius, he ordered the generals whom he had placed in command of the legions to have as many ships as possible built during the winter and the old ones repaired. He explained the principle and indicated the lines on which they were to be built. To enable them to be loaded rapidly and hauled up on shore, he had them made a little shallower than those which are habitually used in the Mediterranean, especially as he found that, owing to the frequent ebb and flow of the tides, the waves there are comparatively small. On the other hand, to carry stores as well as the numerous horses, he built them a little wider than those which we use in other waters. All these vessels he ordered to be constructed both for rowing and sailing, which was greatly facilitated by their low freeboard, and the tackle required for fitting them out to be imported from Spain. After finishing the assizes in Cisalpine Gaul, he started for Illyricum, hearing that the Pirusti were making devastating raids upon the adjacent part of the province. On his arrival, he levied troops from the tribes and ordered them to concentrate at a prescribed place. The Pirusti, on hearing of this, sent envoys to tell him that the authorities were not responsible for anything that had occurred, and declared themselves ready to make full reparation. After listening to what the envoys had to say, Caesar ordered them to furnish hostages, who were to be brought to him by a fixed date, warning them that, in default of compliance, he would attack the tribe. The hostages were brought punctually, in obedience to his orders, and he appointed umpires to weigh the matters in dispute between the several tribes and settle the fines. 2. After disposing of these affairs and finishing the assizes, Caesar returned to Cisalpine Gaul, and thence started to join the army. On his arrival, he inspected all the camps, and found that, thanks to the extraordinary energy of the troops, and notwithstanding the extreme deficiency of resources, about 600 ships of the class described above and 28 galleys had been built, and would be ready for launching in a few days. Heartily commending the soldiers and the officers who had superintended the work, he gave the necessary instructions, and ordered all the ships to assemble at the Itian harbour, from which he had ascertained that the passage to Britain was most convenient, the run from the continent being about 30 miles. Leaving an adequate number of troops to effect this movement, he started with 4 legions in light marching order and 800 horse for the country of the Treveri, as they would not attend his counsels or submit to his authority, and were said to be making overtures to the Transrhenane Germans. 3. This tribe possesses by far the most powerful cavalry in the whole of Gaul, as well as numerous infantry, and, as we have remarked above, its territory reaches the Rhine. 2 rivals, Indutiomarus and Cingetorix, were engaged in a struggle for supremacy. The latter, as soon as the approach of Caesar and his legions was known, presented himself before him, gave an assurance that he and all his followers would remain staunch and not break off their friendship with the Romans, and told him what was going on amongst the Treveri. Indutiomarus, on the other hand, proceeded to levy horse and foot and to make preparations for war, while he sent those who were not of an age to bear arms into the Ardennes, a forest of vast extent, which stretches from the Rhine through the heart of the Treveran territory to the frontier of the Remi. Some leading men, however, of the former tribe, influenced by friendship for Cingetorix and alarmed by the arrival of our army, came to Caesar and, feeling unable to do anything for their country, began to proffer petitions on their own behalf. Thereupon Indutiomarus, afraid of being left in the lurch, sent envoys to Caesar to say that he had only refrained from leaving his followers and presenting himself before him in order to keep the tribe loyal, lest, if all the men of rank left them, the masses, in their ignorance, might fall away. Accordingly the people were under his control, and, if Caesar would allow him, he would wait upon him in his camp and entrust his own interests and those of his community to his protection. 4. Caesar was aware of his motive for saying this and of the circumstances that deterred him from prosecuting his design. Still, in order to avoid having to waste the summer in the country of the Treveri after having made all his preparations for a campaign in Britain, he told Indutiomarus to present himself with 200 hostages. When they were brought, amongst them being a son of Indutiomarus and all his relations, whom Caesar had summoned expressly, he spoke to him kindly and urged him to remain staunch. Nevertheless he summoned the leading men of the Treveri, and called upon them individually to support Cingetorix. He felt that Cingetorix deserved this service at his hands, and at the same time he thought it most important that a man of whose remarkable goodwill towards himself he had clear evidence should, as far as possible, command the respect of his own countrymen. Indutiomarus bitterly resented this action as diminishing his own credit, and, whereas he had already been ill-disposed towards us, this grievance kindled his indignation into a fiercer flame. 5. After settling these affairs, Caesar moved with the legions to the Itian harbour. There he learned that 60 ships, which had been built in the country of the Meldi, had been driven back by stress of weather, and, failing to keep their course, had returned to the point from which they had started. The rest he found completely fitted out and ready for sea. Some 4,000 cavalry from the whole of Gaul and the leading men from all the tribes assembled at the same place. A few of them, whose fidelity he was assured, he had determined to leave in Gaul, taking the rest with him as hostages, as he was afraid that, during his absence, there would be disturbances in the country. 6. Amongst the other hostages was the Aeduan, Dumnorix, of whom we have already spoken. Caesar had determined to keep this man particularly under his eye, because he knew him to be an ardent revolutionary, fond of power, a man of masterful character, and possessing great influence with the Gauls. Moreover, Dumnorix had stated in the Aeduan council that Caesar was going to confer upon him the sovereignty over the tribe, and the Aedui were seriously offended at this remark, and yet did not venture to send envoys to Caesar to protest or to depreciate his intention. Caesar had learned this from natives who were his friends. Dumnorix at first earnestly prayed for leave to remain in Gaul, partly on the ground that he was not accustomed to being on board ship and dreaded the sea, partly, as he alleged, because he was debarred by religious obligations. Finding that his request was steadily refused and that there was no hope of getting Caesar's consent, he began to importune the Gallic magnates, taking them aside one by one and urging them to remain on the continent. He wrought upon their fears. He told them that there was some strong reason for robbing Gaul of all her men of rank. Caesar shrank from putting them to death under the eyes of their countrymen, but his purpose was to take them all over to Britain and there murder them. He made them promise to stay, and called upon them to swear that they would unite in carrying out the policy which they saw to be for the interest of Gaul. These intrigues were reported to Caesar by numerous informants. 7. Having learned the facts, he determined, inasmuch as it was his policy to treat the Aedui with special distinction, that it was his duty to coerce and intimidate Dumnorix by every means in his power, and, as his frenzy was evidently passing all bounds, to see that he did no injury to himself personally or to the public interest. For about 25 days he was kept waiting in the port, because the northwest wind, which commonly blows throughout a great part of the year on these coasts, made it impossible to sail. Accordingly he did his best to keep Dumnorix steady, but at the same time to acquaint himself with all his plans. At length, taking advantage of favourable weather, he ordered the infantry and cavalry to embark. While everybody's attention was distracted, Dumnorix, accompanied by the Aeduan cavalry, left the camp without Caesar's knowledge, and started for his own country. On receiving the news, Caesar broke off his departure, postponed all his arrangements, and sending a strong detachment of cavalry to pursue Dumnorix, ordered him to be brought back, and, in case he resisted and refused to submit, to be put to death. for he thought that a man who disregarded his authority when he was present would not behave rationally in his absence. When called upon to return he resisted, defended himself with vigor, and adjured his retainers to be true to him, crying loudly and repeatedly that he was a free man and belonged to a free people. The cavalry, in obedience to orders, surrounded the fellow and put him to death, but the Aeduan cavalry all returned to Caesar. 8. Having disposed of this business, Caesar, leaving Labienus on the continent with 3 legions and 2,000 cavalry to protect the ports, provide for a supply of corn, ascertain what was passing in Gaul, and act as the circumstances of the moment might dictate, set sail towards the sunset with 5 legions and the same number of cavalry as he had left behind. A light southwesterly breeze wafted him on his way, but about midnight the wind dropped. He failed to keep his course, and, drifting far away with the tide, he descried Britain at daybreak lying behind on the port quarter. Then, following the turn of the tide, he rowed hard to gain the part of the island where, as he had learned in the preceding summer, it was best to land. Footnote: between Deal Castle and Sandwich, a little north of where he landed in 55 B.C. End footnote. The energy shown by the soldiers on this occasion was most praiseworthy. Rowing hard without a break they kept up in their heavily laden transports with the ships of war. The ships all reached Britain about midday, but no enemy was visible. Large numbers, as Caesar found out afterwards from prisoners, had assembled on the spot, but, alarmed by the great number of ships, more than 800 of which, counting those of the preceding year and the private vessels which individuals had built for their own convenience, were visible at once, they had quitted the shore and withdrawn to the higher ground. 9. Caesar disembarked the army and chose a suitable spot for a camp. Footnote: perhaps on the gently rising ground near Worth. End footnote. Having ascertained from prisoners where the enemy's forces were posted, he left 10 cohorts and 300 cavalry near the sea to protect the ships, and marched against the enemy about the 3rd watch. He felt little anxiety for the ships, as he was leaving them at anchor on a nice open shore. The ships and the detachment which protected them were placed under the command of Quintus Atrius. After a night march of about 12 miles Caesar descried the enemy's force. Advancing with their cavalry and chariots from higher ground towards a river, they attempted to check our men and force on an action. Footnote: the river was the Great Star, and Caesar crossed it near Canterbury, probably at Thannington. End footnote. Beaten off by the cavalry, they fell back into the woods and occupied a well-fortified post of great natural strength, which they had apparently prepared for defense some time before with a view to intestine war, for all the entrances were blocked by felled trees laid close together. Footnote: probably Bigbury Camp, about a mile and a half west of Canterbury, traces of which still exist. End footnote. Fighting in scattered groups, they threw missiles from the woods, and tried to prevent our men from penetrating within the defenses. But the soldiers of the 7th Legion, locking their shields over their heads, and piling up lumber against the defenses, captured the position and drove them out of the woods at the cost of a few wounded. Caesar, however, forbade them to pursue the fugitives far, partly because he had no knowledge of the ground, partly because much of the day was spent and he wished to leave time for entrenching his camp. 10. On the following morning he sent a light force of infantry and cavalry, in 3 columns, to pursue the fugitives. They had advanced a considerable distance, the rear guard being just in sight, when some troopers from Quintus Atrius came to Caesar with the news that there had been a great storm on the preceding night, and that almost all the ships had been damaged and gone ashore, as the anchors and the cables did not hold, and the seamen and their captains could not cope with the force of the storm. The collisions between different vessels had therefore caused heavy loss. 11. On receiving this information, Caesar recalled the legions and cavalry, ordering them to defend themselves as they marched, and went back himself to the ships. He saw with his own eyes much the same as he had learned from the messengers and the dispatch which they brought. About 40 ships were lost, but it seemed possible to repair the rest, though at cost of considerable trouble. Accordingly he selected skilled workmen from the legions and ordered others to be sent for from the continent, at the same time writing to tell Labienus to build as many ships as possible with the legions under his command. Although it involved great trouble and labor, he decided that the best plan would be to have all the ships hauled up and connected with the camp by one entrenchment. About 10 days were spent in these operations, the troops not suspending work even in the night. As soon as the ships were hauled up and the camp strongly fortified, Caesar left the same force as before to protect them, and advanced to the point from which he had returned. By the time that he arrived, reinforcements of Britons had assembled on the spot from all sides. The chief command and the general direction of the campaign had been entrusted by common consent to Castellanus, whose territories are separated from those of the maritime tribes by a river called the Thames, about 80 miles from the sea. He had therefore been incessantly at war with the other tribes, but in their alarm at our arrival the Britons had made him commander-in-chief. 12. The interior of Britain is inhabited by a people who, according to oral tradition, so the Britons themselves say, are aboriginal, the maritime districts by immigrants who crossed over from Belgium to plunder and attack the aborigines, almost all of them being called after the tribes from whom the first comers were an offshoot. When the war was over they remained in the country and settled down as tillers of the soil. The population is immense. Homesteads, closely resembling those of the Gauls, are met with at every turn, and cattle are very numerous. Gold coins are in use, or, instead of coins, iron bars of fixed weight. Tin is found in the country in the inland, and iron in the maritime districts, but the latter only in small quantities. Bronze is imported. Trees exist of all the varieties which occur in Gaul, except the beech and the fir. Hares, fowls, and geese they think it impious to taste, but they keep them for pastime or amusement. The climate is more equable than in Gaul, the cold being less severe. 13. The island is triangular in shape, one side being opposite Gaul. One corner of this side, by Kent, the landing place for almost all the ships from Gaul, has an easterly, and the lower one a southerly aspect. The extent of this side is about 500 miles. The second trends westward towards Spain. Off the coast there is Ireland, which is considered only half as large as Britain, though the passage is equal in length to that between Britain and Gaul. Halfway across is an island called Man, and several smaller islands also are believed to be situated opposite this coast, in which, according to some writers, there is continuous night, about the winter solstice, for 30 days. Our inquiries could elicit no information on the subject, but by accurate measurements with a water clock we could see that the nights were shorter than on the continent. The length of this side, according to the estimate of the natives, is 700 miles. The third side has a northerly aspect, and no land lies opposite it. Its corner, however, looks, if anything, in the direction of Germany. The length of this side is estimated at 800 miles. Thus the whole island is 2,000 miles in circumference. 14. By far the most civilized of all the natives are the inhabitants of Kent, a purely maritime district, whose culture does not differ much from that of the Gauls. The people of the interior do not, for the most part, cultivate grain, but live on milk and flesh meat and clothe themselves with skins. All the Britons, without exception, stain themselves with woad, which produces a bluish tint. This gives them a wild look in battle. They wear their hair long, and shave the whole of their body except the head and the upper lip. Groups of 10 or 12 men have wives in common, brothers generally sharing with each other and fathers with their sons. The offspring of these unions are counted as the children of the man to whose home the mother, as a virgin, was originally taken. End of chapter 14. Book 5, chapters 15 to 23 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 5, Chapter 15. The enemy's horsemen and charioteers kept up a fierce running fight with their cavalry, the latter, however, getting the best of it at all points, and driving the enemy into the woods and onto the hills. They killed a good many, but, pursuing too eagerly, lost some of their own number. After a time, while our men were off their guard and occupied in entrenching their camp, the enemy suddenly dashed out of the woods, swooped down upon the outpost in front of the camp, and engaged it in a hot combat. And when Caesar sent 2 cohorts, the first of their respective legions, to the rescue, which were separated from each other by a very small interval, our men were unnerved by tactics which were new to them, and they boldly charged between the two and got back unhurt. Quintus Liberius Durus, a military tribune, was killed that day. After additional cohorts had been sent up, the enemy were beaten off. 16. Throughout this peculiar combat, which was fought in full view of everyone and actually in front of the camp, it was clear that the infantry, owing to the weight of their armor, were ill-fitted to engage an enemy of this kind, for they could not pursue him when he retreated, and they dared not abandon their regular formation. Also that the cavalry fought at great risk, because the enemy generally fell back on purpose, and, after drawing our men a little distance away from the legions, leaped down from their chariots and fought on foot with the odds in their favor. On the other hand, the mode in which their cavalry fought exposed the Romans, alike in retreat and in pursuit, to an exactly similar danger. Footnote: Caesar probably meant that the mode in which the British cavalry fought, in cooperation with the charioteers, exposed the Romans, alike in retreat and in pursuit, to exactly the same danger. End footnote. Besides, the Britons never fought in masses, but in groups separated by wide intervals. They posted reserves and relieved each other in succession, fresh vigorous men taking the places of those who were tired. 17. Next day the enemy occupied a position on the heights at a distance from the camp, and began to show themselves in scattered groups and harass our cavalry, but with less vigor than the day before. At midday, however, Caesar having sent 3 legions and all his cavalry on a foraging expedition under one of his generals, Gains Trebonius, they suddenly swooped down from all points on the foragers, not hesitating to attack the ordered ranks of the legions. The men charged them vigorously, beat them off, and continued to pursue them until the cavalry, relying upon the support of the legions, which they saw behind them, drove them headlong. They killed a great many of them and never allowed them to rally or make a stand or get down from their chariots. After this rout the reinforcements, which had assembled from all sides, immediately dispersed, and from that time the enemy never encountered us in a general action. 18. Having ascertained the enemy's plans, Caesar led his army to the Thames, into the territories of Cassivellaunus. The river can only be forded at one spot, and there with difficulty. On reaching this place, he observed that the enemy were drawn up in great force near the opposite bank of the river. The bank was fenced by sharp stakes planted along its edge, and similar stakes were fixed under water and concealed by the river. Having learned these facts from prisoners and deserters, Caesar sent his cavalry on in front, and ordered the legions to follow them speedily. But the men advanced with such swiftness and dash, though they only had their heads above water, that the enemy, unable to withstand the combined onset of infantry and cavalry, quitted the bank and fled. 19. Cassivellaunus, abandoning, as we have remarked above, all thoughts of regular combat, disbanded the greater part of his force, retaining only about 4,000 charioteers, watched our line of march, and, moving a little way from the track, concealed himself in impenetrable wooded spots, and removed the cattle and inhabitants from the open country into the woods in those districts through which he had learned that we intended to march. Whenever our cavalry made a bold dash into the country to plunder and devastate, he sent his charioteers out of the woods, for he was familiar with every track and path, engaged the cavalry to their great peril, and by the fear which he thus inspired prevented them from moving far afield. Caesar now had no choice but to forbid them to move out of touch with the column of infantry, and, by ravaging the country and burning villages, to injure the enemy as far as the legionnaires' powers of endurance would allow. 20. Meanwhile the Trinovantes, about the strongest tribe in that part of the country, sent envoys to Caesar, promising to surrender and obey his commands. Mandubrasius, a young chief of this tribe, whose father had been their king and had been put to death by Cassivellaunus, but who saved his own life by flight, had gone to the continent to join Caesar, and thrown himself upon his protection. The Trinovantes begged Caesar to protect Mandubrasius from harm at the hands of Cassivellaunus, and to send him to rule over his own people with full powers. Caesar sent Mandubrasius, but ordered them to furnish 40 hostages and grain for his army. They promptly obeyed his commands, sending hostages to the number required and also the grain. 21. As the Trinovantes had been granted protection and immunity from all injury on the part of the soldiers, the Senemagni, Segontiaci, and Calites, Bibrosi, and Cassi sent embassies to Caesar and surrendered. Footnote: the Senemagni were perhaps identical with the Esseni or Iceni, who inhabited Suffolk and Norfolk. The Segontiaci may have been conterminous with, and were probably north of, the Atrebates, who occupied parts of Hampshire and Berkshire. The Bibrosi may have dwelt in Berkshire. All that is known about the geographical position of the Ancalites and Cassi is that they lived somewhere in the basin of the Thames, west or possibly north of the Trinovantian territory in Essex. End footnote. He learned from the envoys that the stronghold of Cassivellaunus, which was protected by woods and marshes, was not far off, and that a considerable number of men and of cattle had assembled in it. The Britons apply the name of stronghold to any woodland spot, difficult of access and fortified with a rampart and trench, to which they are in the habit of resorting in order to escape a hostile raid. Caesar marched to the spot indicated with his legions, and found that the place was of great natural strength and well fortified. Nevertheless he proceeded to assault it on 2 sides. The enemy stood their ground a short time, but could not sustain the onset of our infantry, and fled precipitately from another part of the stronghold. A great quantity of cattle was found in the place, and many of the garrison were captured as they were trying to escape, and killed. 22. While the operations above mentioned were going on in this district, Cassivellaunus sent envoys to Kent, which, as we have remarked above, is close to the sea, ordering Cingetonx, Carvilius, Taximugulus, and Segovax, the 4 kings who ruled over the country, to collect all their forces, and make a sudden descent upon the naval camp, and attack it. When they reached the camp, the officers made a sortie, killed many of them, captured their leader Legotorix, a man of rank, and withdrew their men without loss. On receiving news of the action, Cassivellaunus, who was greatly alarmed by the defection of the tribes, following the numerous disasters which he had sustained and the ravaging of his country, availed himself of the mediation of the Atrebatian, Commius, and sent envoys to Caesar to propose surrender. Caesar had resolved to winter on the continent, because disturbances were likely to break out suddenly in Gaul. Not much of the summer remained, and the enemy, as he knew, could easily spin out the time. Accordingly he ordered hostages to be given, and fixed the tribute which Britain was to pay annually to the Roman people, at the same time strictly forbidding Cassivellaunus to molest Mandubrasius or the Trinovantes. 23. On receiving the hostages, he led back the army to the sea, where he found the ships repaired. When they were launched, he arranged to take the army back in 2 trips, as he had a large number of prisoners and some ships had been destroyed by the storm. It so happened that of all this numerous fleet, after so many voyages, not a single vessel conveying troops was lost either in this or in the preceding year, while of the ships that were empty, comprising those which had landed troops after the first trip and were sent back to Caesar from the continent, and 60 others which Labienus had constructed after the wreck, only a very few reached their destination, nearly all the rest being driven back. Caesar waited for them a considerable time in vain, and then, for fear the lateness of the season, just before the equinox, should prevent his sailing, he was obliged to pack the troops rather closely. A dead calm followed, and unmooring at the beginning of the second watch, he reached land at dawn and brought all the ships safe ashore. End of chapter 23. Book 5, chapters 24 to 37 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 5, Chapter 24. The harvest that year in Gaul had been scanty on account of drought, and accordingly, after beaching the ships and holding a council of the Gallic deputies at Samarobrava, Caesar was compelled to quarter the army for the winter on a different principle from that which he had followed in former years, distributing the legions among several tribes. He assigned one of them to Gaius Fabius, one of his generals, another to Quintus Cicero, and a third to Lucius Roscius, with orders to march them into the countries of the Morini, the Nervii, and the Asuvii respectively, quartered the fourth under Titus Labienus in the country of the Remi, just on the frontier of the Treveri, and stationed 3 in Belgium under the command of the quaestor, Marcus Crassus, and 2 generals, Lucius Menatius Plancus and Gaius Trebonius. A single legion, which he had recently raised north of the Po, was sent, along with 5 cohorts, into the country of the Eburones, a people ruled by Ambiorix and Catuvolcus, the greater part of whose territory is between the Meuse and the Rhine. Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Anroncalius Cotta were ordered to take command of these troops. This method of distributing the legions Caesar regarded as the easiest way of remedying the scarcity of corn. And in fact the quarters of all the legions, except the one which he had sent under Lucius Roscius into a perfectly tranquil and undisturbed district, were enclosed within an area whose extreme points were only 100 miles apart. Caesar determined to remain himself in Gaul until he ascertained that the legions were in their several positions and their camps entrenched. 25. Among the Carnutes was a man of noble birth, named Tesgetius, whose ancestors had held sovereignty in their own country, and to whom Caesar, in recognition of his energy and devotion, for in all his campaigns he had found his services exceptionally valuable, had restored their position. He was now in the 3rd year of his reign when his enemies, with the avowed sanction of many of the citizens, assassinated him. The crime was reported to Caesar. Fearing that, as many were implicated, the tribe might be impelled by them to revolt, he ordered Lucius Plancus to march rapidly with his legion from Belgium into the country of the Carnutes, winter there, and arrest and send to him the individuals whom he found responsible for Tesgetius's death. Meanwhile he was informed by all the officers under whose command he had placed the legions, that they had reached their respective quarters and that the positions were entrenched. 26. About 15 days after the positions had been taken up, a sudden and alarming revolt was started by Ambiorix and Catuvolcus. They had waited upon Sabinus and Cotta at the frontier of their kingdom and conveyed the corn to the camp, when, egged on by emissaries from the Treveran, Indutiomarus, they roused their tribesmen, suddenly overpowered a fatigue party who were cutting wood, and came with a large force to attack the camp. Our men speedily armed and mounted the rampart. Some Spanish horse were sent out from one side and came off victorious in a cavalry combat, and the enemy, seeing the futility of their attempt, called off their troops. Then, after the manner of their nation, they shouted for some one on our side to go out and parley with them, declaring that they had something to say, affecting both sides, which, they hoped, might settle disputes. 27. Gaius Arpinius, a Roman knight, who was intimate with Quintus Titanus, was sent to confer with them, accompanied by one Quintus Junius, a Spaniard, who had been in the habit of visiting Ambiorix as Caesar's representative. Ambiorix addressed them in the following terms. He would admit that he was deeply indebted to Caesar for various acts of kindness, having by his good offices been relieved of tribute which he had regularly paid to his neighbors, the Aduatuci, while his own son and his brothers, who had been sent to them as hostages and by them enslaved and imprisoned, had been sent back by Caesar. Moreover, in attacking the camp, he had not acted spontaneously or on his own judgment, but under the compulsion of the tribe, his sovereignty being so far limited that the multitude had no less power over him than he over them. Furthermore, the tribe had only taken up arms because it was unable to resist a sudden conspiracy on the part of the Gauls. This he could easily prove from his own insignificance, for he was not so ignorant of affairs as to imagine that his troops could get the better of the Roman people. Gaul, however, was unanimous that very day had been fixed for a general attack on Caesar's camps, to prevent any one legion from assisting another. It was not easy for Gauls to refuse help to their countrymen, especially as the object of the movement was, of course, to recover national liberty. However, having done his duty to them on the score of patriotism, he now thought of what he owed to Caesar for his favors. He therefore urged, nay, implored, Titurius, as a friend whose salt he had eaten, to consider his own and his soldiers' safety. A large force of German mercenaries had crossed the Rhine, and would be at hand in a couple of days. It was for the Roman generals to decide whether they would withdraw their troops from camp before the neighboring tribes could find out, and transfer them either to Cicero or to Labienus, the former of whom was about 50 miles off, the latter rather more. He would solemnly promise on oath to grant them a safe conduct through his territory. In so doing he was acting in the interests of his tribe, which would be relieved from the burden of the camp, and showing his gratitude for Caesar's services. After this speech Ambiorix withdrew. 28. Arpinius and Junius reported to the generals what they had heard. The suddenness of the news made them anxious, and although it came from an enemy, they did not think it wise to disregard it. What most alarmed them was that it seemed hardly credible that an obscure and insignificant tribe like the Eburones would have ventured to make war upon the Roman people on their own account. Accordingly they referred the question to a council of war, and a violent dispute arose between them. Lucius Aurunculeius and many of the tribunes and chief centurions held that it would not be right to take any step without due consideration or to leave the camp without authority from Caesar. They pointed out that, as the camp was fortified, it was possible to hold out against any force, even of Germans. Experience proved this, for they had resolutely sustained the enemy's first onslaught and inflicted heavy loss upon him into the bargain. They were not pressed for supplies, and reinforcements would arrive in time from the nearest camp and from Caesar himself. Finally, what could be more puerile or more unsoldierlike than to make a momentous decision on the advice of an enemy? 29. In opposition to these arguments, Titurius loudly insisted that it would be too late to act when the enemy's reinforcements had arrived with their German allies, or the nearest camp had suffered a disaster. The time for deliberation was short. Caesar, so he believed, had started for Italy, otherwise the Carnutes would not have dreamed of putting Tasgetius to death, nor, if Caesar had been at hand, would the Eburones have held our men so cheap as to attack the camp. It was not to the enemy that he looked for guidance, but to facts. The Rhine was close by. The Germans were embittered by the death of Ariovistus and our earlier victories. Gaul was ablaze with indignation at all the indignities she had suffered, at her subjugation to the dominion of the Roman people, and at the eclipse of her former military renown. Finally, who could persuade himself that Ambiorix had ventured upon an enterprise like this without solid support? His advice was safe either way if nothing untoward happened. They would get to the nearest legion without any danger. If the whole of Gaul were in league with the Germans, their only safety was in prompt action. As to Cotta and those who took the opposite view, what would be the result of following their counsel? It involved, if not immediate danger, at all events the prospect of a long blockade accompanied by famine. 30. Such were the arguments on both sides, and, as Cotta and the chief centurions continued to oppose him vehemently, Sabinus, raising his voice, so that a large number of the soldiers might hear, cried, Have your own way, if you like. Death has no more terrors for me than for you. The men will judge, and if any disaster happens, they'll call you to account for it, whereas if you, Cotta, would consent, on the day after tomorrow they would join their comrades in the nearest camp and share the fortune of war with them, instead of perishing by the sword or by famine, like outcasts far removed from their fellows. 31. The assembled officers stood up. They took the two generals by the hand and implored them not to precipitate a disaster by quarreling and obstinacy. Go or stay, everything could be managed if only they were all unanimous. But no good, that they could see, would come from quarreling. The dispute dragged on till midnight. At length Cotta, overborne by superior authority, gave way. Sabinus's view prevailed. An order was issued that the troops were to march at daybreak. The men stayed up for the rest of the night, every one looking about to see what he could take with him, what part of his winter's kit he would be forced to leave behind. Men thought of every argument to persuade themselves that they could not remain without danger, and that the danger would be increased by protracted watches and consequent exhaustion. At dawn they marched out of camp, like men convinced that the Ambiorix who had counselled them was no enemy, but the best of friends, in a column of extraordinary length and with an immense baggage train. Footnote: Sabinus was the senior officer. End footnote. 32. The enemy, perceiving from the hum of voices in the night and the Romans remaining up that they had resolved to go, stationed themselves in ambush in two divisions in the woods, in a convenient position, screened from observation, about 2 miles off, to await their arrival, and when the bulk of the column had moved down into a large defile, they suddenly showed themselves on either side of it, hustled forward the rear guard, checked the ascent of the van, and forced on a combat on a spot most unfavorable for our men. 33. And now Titurius, having exercised no forethought, lost all nerve, ran from place to place, and tried to get the cohorts into formation, but he did this nervously and in such a way that one could see that he was at his wits' end, as indeed generally happens to men who are forced to decide on the spur of the moment. Cotta, on the other hand, who had foreseen that these things might happen on the march, and for that reason had declined to sanction the movement, was fully equal to the occasion. He performed a general's part in calling upon the men and encouraging them, and in action he did the work of a private soldier. Owing to the length of the column, it was not easy for the generals to look to everything themselves and make the necessary arrangements for every part of the field. They therefore ordered the word to be given to abandon the baggage and form in a square. Although, in the circumstances, the plan cannot be condemned, its effect was nevertheless disastrous, for, as it would evidently not have been resorted to but for extreme anxiety and despair, it made our soldiers despondent and stimulated the enemy's ardor for battle. Moreover, as was inevitable, soldiers were everywhere abandoning their companies, everyone hurrying to the baggage train to look for his most cherished possessions and carry them off, while the whole field was a scene of weeping and uproar. 34. The natives, on their part, showed no lack of resource. Their leaders ordered the word to be passed along the line that no man was to stir from his post. The booty was their prize, and whatever the Romans left was to be kept for them. They were to remember, then, that everything depended upon victory. Our men were as brave as they and not overmatched in point of numbers. Forsaken by their leader and by fortune, they trusted for safety to courage alone, and as often as a cohort charged, there many of the enemy fell. Observing this, Ambiorix ordered the word to be given for the tribesmen to throw their missiles from a distance and not go too close. Whenever the Romans charged, they were to fall back. Being lightly armed and in constant training, they could not suffer. When the Romans attempted to rejoin their companies, they were to pursue. 35. The order was carefully obeyed. Whenever a cohort left the square and charged, the enemy ran swiftly away. Meanwhile the cohort was necessarily exposed, and missiles fell on its unshielded flank. When the men began to return to the position they had left, they were surrounded by the enemy who stood near them as well as by those who had fallen back. If, on the other hand, they chose to hold their ground, there was no room for courage, and, being crowded together, they could not avoid the missiles hurled by that huge host. Yet, harassed by all these disadvantages and in spite of heavy loss, they held out, and throughout a combat which lasted the greater part of the day, from dawn till the 8th hour, they did nothing unworthy of themselves. At this moment Titus Balventius, who, in the previous year, had been chief centurion of his legion, a brave and highly respected man, had both his thighs pierced by a javelin. Quintus Lucanius, an officer of the same rank, while trying to save his son, who had been surrounded, was killed, fighting most gallantly, and Lucius Cotta, while cheering on all the cohorts and centuries, was struck full in the face by a stone from a sling. 36. Quintus Titurius was greatly agitated at the aspect of affairs, and descrying Ambiorix some way off haranguing his men, he sent his interpreter Gnaeus Pompeius to ask for quarter for himself and the troops. In reply to this appeal, Ambiorix said that Titurius might speak to him if he liked. He hoped that the host might be induced to consent as far as the safety of the troops was concerned. Titurius, at all events, should come to no harm, and for that he would pledge his word. Sabinus consulted the wounded Cotta, proposing that, if he approved, they should withdraw from the action and together confer with Ambiorix, who might, he hoped, be induced to spare both them and the troops. Cotta replied that he would not meet an armed enemy, and to this resolve he adhered. 37. Sabinus ordered the tribunes and chief centurions whom he had round him at the moment to follow him. On approaching Ambiorix, he was ordered to lay down his arms, and obeyed, telling his officers to do the same. The principals were discussing about terms, and Ambiorix was purposely making a long speech, when Sabinus was gradually surrounded and slain. Then, in the native fashion, they shouted victory, and with a loud yell dashed into our ranks and broke them. Lucius Cotta fell fighting where he stood, and the bulk of the men with him. The rest retreated to the camp, whence they had come. Lucius Petrosidius, the standard-bearer, finding himself beset by a multitude of enemies, threw his eagle inside the rampart, and, fighting most gallantly in front of the camp, was slain. His comrades with difficulty sustained the onslaught till night. Then, seeing that hope was gone, they all slew each other to the last man. A few, who had slipped away from the battle, made their way by the woodland tracks to the quarters of Titus Labienus and told him what had occurred. End of chapter 37.